They called her the quiet one. The one who took the stairs instead of the elevator, who kept earbuds in during breaks, who moved through Sacred Heart's ER like she was apologizing for existing. That's what Dr. Marcus Caldwell saw when Katie Morrison pushed through the double doors at 10:08 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October, just another night nurse with a limp, favoring her left leg, taking the long route to the supply closet to avoid conversation. What he didn't see was the way her hands moved through triage. 7 seconds to check vitals. 7 seconds flat. Pulse, respiration, blood pressure, O2 sat, her fingers finding each point with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this while mortar rounds shook the walls. Caldwell stood at the charge station reviewing charts, his $3,200 Rolex catching the fluorescent lights as he turned a page, and he watched her work. Watched her recalibrate the 4-pump on bed for without being asked. Watched her catch the tremor in an intern's hands during a central line placement and quietly reposition his elbows. Watched her know things before anyone said them. The recognition hit him like cold antiseptic. This wasn't just competence. This was authority wearing scrubs and a limp. This was someone who'd held power before, and the loss of it was still fresh enough to make her cautious. Caldwell had built his reputation on a very specific kind of power. 14 years as ER chief, 3 consulting contracts with the Navy Medical Corps, board connections that stretched from Norfolk to Walter Reed, and the kind of gravitational pull that made junior doctors hang on his every word. He was the kind of man who expected to be the smartest person in any room. The kind of man who measured authority by how quickly people deferred to him. And Katie Morrison didn't defer. She simply knew. The night shift droned on. 11:33 p.m., and Trauma 2 came alive. 47-year-old male, septic shock, blood pressure tanking, lactate elevated, core temp 104.2 degrees. The patient was crashing before he hit the bed. Caldwell moved in with the kind of decisive confidence that usually worked. He barked orders like commands. Fluid bolus. Empiric antibiotics. Norepinephrine drip at 0.05 micrograms per kilogram per minute. The resident scribbled notes, hands shaking slightly. She was new, maybe 6 weeks in, and Caldwell dictated faster, his voice rising in that particular way that made everyone around him move like they were underwater. Katie stood at the edge of the trauma bay, vital signs monitor in her hands, watching the numbers. BP 62/41. Heart rate 132. The lactate was already climbing. The norepinephrine dose Caldwell had ordered wasn't just wrong. It was dangerous. Too aggressive for a patient this unstable. A vasopressor at that concentration could push a septic shock patient into profound hypertension, could trigger dysrhythmias, could stop the heart in under 4 minutes. Katie had seen it before. Ramadi. 2011, FOB Shank, when they'd lost a Marine to exactly this kind of cascade, good intentions, bad math, dead soldier. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask permission. She simply moved toward the fall line and said 0.02 micrograms per kilogram. Not 0.05. Her voice wasn't loud. It was barely above the hum of the ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in the corner. But the room went silent. Caldwell's head snapped toward her like she'd slapped him. His face flushed red, a deep, authentic anger that made the veins in his neck stand out. "I beg your pardon." The words were quiet. Dangerous. Everyone in Trauma 2 felt it. The air pressure in the room seemed to shift. The resident froze, for bag halfway to the pump. A nurse at the bedside looked away. This was the moment. This was where hierarchy reasserted itself. Where someone new, someone quiet, someone with a limp and no rank, got reminded of her place. Katie didn't flinch. She met Caldwell's eyes with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Half that dose. Patients in compensated septic shock. Aggressive. Vasopressor will trigger dysrhythmia. She turned back to the monitor without waiting for approval. Her hands were steady as she adjusted the drip. Steady as surgical lasers. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the patient's heart rate dropped from 132 to 89. The color returned to his lips. The lactate line began its slow descent. Caldwell watched it happen. Watched this limping night nurse fix his mistake without making it about him, without the dramatic correction that would have required apologies and explanations. She simply did the right thing. And everyone in the room knew it. He turned and walked out without a word. But his jaw was clenched so tight it looked like his face might crack. The door to Trauma 2 swung shut behind him, and he stood in the hallway for exactly 47 seconds, long enough to understand what he was looking at. This woman wasn't just a threat to his authority. She was a threat to the entire structure that kept him elevated. Because competence like that didn't come from night shifts and limp-induced humility. It came from somewhere else. Somewhere before. And if anyone else figured that out, if anyone connected those dots, the hierarchy would collapse. By 6:51 a.m., when the day shift arrived and Katie was already in the parking lot, Caldwell had already decided. He'd been in medicine long enough to recognize a predator when he saw one. The difference was, he didn't understand yet that he was looking at something far more dangerous than himself. He was looking at someone who had nothing left to lose. 3 years. That's how long Katie had been building her invisibility at Sacred Heart. 3 years of choosing the graveyard shift, of eating lunch alone in the hospital chapel, of letting colleagues assume the scar tissue on her left leg came from a car accident when she was 18. Of letting them assume she was just quiet. Just careful. Just someone who preferred solitude. What they didn't know was that solitude was survival. The ER was the safest place she'd found since Ramadi. No one asked questions here. No one dug into files. No one knew who Major Katie Morrison had been before the IED that shattered her femur in 3 places, before the infection that took out half the soft tissue in her calf, before the court-martial that tried to take out the rest. She wore her scrubs loose to hide the tremor in her right hand that still surfaced when helicopters passed overhead. She took stairs instead of elevators because the acceleration made her claustrophobic. She wore her late husband's wedding ring on a chain under her uniform, removed only for surgery, because seeing it on her finger made breathing difficult. The patch from the 7th Special Forces Group was still there, sewn inside her jacket lining against her ribs. She touched it sometimes, usually when she was sitting at Marcus's grave. 5:42 a.m., Tuesday morning, rain hammering the cemetery in Norfolk like applause for the dead. Katie stood with her hands in her pockets, looking down at the headstone that read Marcus James Morrison, 1982 to 2012, beloved husband, loving father. Only the first part was true anymore. The loving part was long gone. She pressed her hand against the scar tissue on her left leg, the muscle memory of pain still electrical, still fresh. 12 years out of the military and her body still responded to stimuli like she was waiting for the next explosion. The rain soaked through her jacket, and she could feel the outline of the unit patch against her ribs through the wet fabric. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she whispered to the headstone. "I failed again. Just like I failed you in Ramadi." The words came out ragged, broken in a way her voice never sounded at the hospital. Here, at the grave, Katie was different. Here she was allowed to break. Here no one was watching. The rain picked up, turning the cemetery into something between a requiem and a drowning, and Katie stood perfectly still, letting it fall. Because in 3 days, her life would change in a way she couldn't anticipate. In 3 days, a man would crash through those ER doors who would force her to choose between invisibility and identity. In 3 days, everything she'd buried would come back. But right now, in the rain, with her dead husband's name carved into granite, Katie Morrison was just a woman who'd lost everything trying to save someone else. The cemetery was empty except for the crows. The rain sounded like helicopter rotors in the distance. And Katie didn't move. She never did when she was here. She just stood at the grave, hand pressed against her scar, and whispered apologies to a man who couldn't hear them anymore. The overhead page crackled at 0200 hours, Dr. Caldwell's voice echoing across every floor of Sacred Heart. "Nurse Katie, your boyfriend's coding in Trauma 2, better hurry, sweetheart." The nursing station erupted in snickers. Two residents looked up from their computers, grins spreading like contagion. A respiratory therapist whispered something that made another nurse laugh. Katie set down her chart without hurrying. Without flinching. She stood with the kind of stillness that comes from having already survived the worst, and one single tear escaped her left eye. She wiped it with one deliberate motion, never breaking stride, and walked into Trauma 2 to find a CPR mannequin on the gurney, its plastic face frozen in agony, a marker message scrawled across its chest, Katie's type. Caldwell was waiting in the corner with two residents, their phones out, ready to record whatever humiliation came next. He was studying her face for a crack. A tremor. A voice that would waver. He wanted to see her break. Instead, Katie took one measured breath, let her gaze move across each of them, settling on Caldwell last, her eyes the color of winter slate, and said in a voice as flat as a heartline, "I've survived worse men than you, doctor." She turned and walked out, her limp more pronounced in the fluorescent lights, her hand trembling only after the door closed behind her. The residents exchanged looks. Caldwell's jaw clenched so hard you could see the muscle work beneath his skin. For hours later, Katie was restocking the supply closet on the third floor, counting endotracheal tubes on the metal shelves, when Caldwell blocked the doorway with his body. The light from the hallway caught the edge of his Rolex, a $16,000 watch meant to advertise what he believed he'd earned. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The closet smelled like antiseptic and stale air. "You embarrass me," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more threatening than a shout. "Yesterday. That septic patient. You corrected my dosage like I'm some intern fresh out of medical school." His finger jabbed the air near her face, not quite touching. "You're a night nurse with a limp who can barely make it through a shift. You think your quiet little competence makes you special. Makes you worthy of challenging my orders." He moved closer, backing her against the shelving unit. The metal edge pressed cold against her spine. One more act of insubordination. One more correction. One more moment of your little superiority routine, and you're done. I don't care how perfect your charts are. I don't care if you save someone's life. I own this ER. I own your future here. Do you understand me?" Katie's breath stayed even. Her eyes never left his. The tremor that had started in her hand was nowhere near her voice. "Noted," she said. She waited. He waited. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them like angry insects. Finally, he stepped back, straightened his tie, perfectly centered, perfectly pressed, and said, "Good girl." He left. The supply closet door swung closed with a pneumatic hiss. Katie's hand shook for 7 minutes after he left, but only when she was alone. The morning shift was arriving at 0630 when Caldwell made his final move. He called Katie to the parking lot where 17 staff members were clocking in, the sun rising pale and cold over Norfolk, the air smelling like rain coming. He stood beside his Mercedes, dark blue, impeccable paint, personalized license plate reading ER Chief, his voice carrying across the asphalt with surgical precision. "Nurse Morrison," he announced, loud enough that every arriving nurse could hear, loud enough that the security guard paused at the employee entrance. "Effective immediately, you're being moved to custodial duties pending a performance review. Your clinical judgment is being questioned. Your medication calculations have raised concerns. And until the board completes their investigation, you're restricted from patient care. You'll report to the maintenance supervisor at 0700 hours. Security will escort you if there's any resistance." The arriving nurses froze mid-step. One dropped her badge. Another whispered something to her partner. Katie felt the weight of their stares, the kind of stares that said asterisk she must have done something wrong star. The kind of stares that believed authority. Caldwell was already pulling out his phone, making a show of texting someone important, establishing his narrative before anyone heard her version. Katie felt the faded patch inside her jacket, 7th Special Forces Group, the insignia she'd sewn into the lining 3 years ago when she arrived at Sacred Heart, a reminder of who she used to be when she could afford to remember. Her leg ached from standing this long. The tremor was spreading from her hand up her arm. One measured breath. One tear she wiped without looking away from Caldwell's face. "Understood, doctor," she said, and her voice was so steady it might have been spoken by someone else entirely. She turned toward her car, a 10-year-old Honda with rust spreading from the wheel wells like a disease, and didn't let her hand shake until the door was closed and locked. She gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles went white. 18 years. 18 years of rebuilding. 18 years of learning how to be invisible enough to survive, competent enough to matter, broken enough to know better than to hope. And Caldwell had dismantled it in 90 minutes because her steadiness threatened his noise, because her competence made his incompetence visible, because some men couldn't bear being corrected by anyone they decided was beneath them. She didn't drive home. She sat in the parking lot and watched the staff filing in for the day shift, watched them exchange gossip about the night shift nurse who'd been demoted for insubordination, watched the story take root and spread like an infection through the hospital's nervous system. By lunch, everyone would know the version Caldwell had already begun distributing. By evening, she would be the nurse who couldn't follow orders. The nurse with a drinking problem, whether she drank or not. The nurse whose medical judgment had become questionable. The nurse who deserved what was coming. At 1800 hours, Katie was cleaning the 4th-floor hallway with a mop and a bucket of water that smelled like industrial bleach, pushing the wet strings across linoleum in methodical strokes, when the trauma alert sounded. Her body responded before her mind caught up, muscles tightening, breathing changing, the autonomic response of someone who'd spent 18 months responding to incoming fire. Trauma alert, the overhead system announced. Critical transfer inbound. ETA 3 minutes. Special Forces Colonel, multiple GSW, flatline twice in transport. All available surgical staff to Trauma Bay 1. Katie's mop went still. Multiple gunshot wounds. Special Forces. Flatline twice in transport. The pieces assembled themselves without her permission. She moved toward the stairwell by instinct, muscle memory overriding everything else, and then she stopped. She was custodial now. Restricted. Caldwell had made it clear. She was no longer permitted in the clinical spaces, no longer trusted with decisions, no longer needed. The ER doors burst open 3 floors below. She watched from the landing as they wheeled the gurney past, the emergency team surrounding the patient, their voices urgent and clipped. The patient's face was visible for just 2 seconds. Long enough to recognize. Long enough for her entire body to go numb. Colonel Richard Hale. The man who'd court-martialed her in Ramadi. The officer who'd signed the orders that destroyed everything, her career, her clearance, her marriage to Marcus before the insurgent attack claimed him anyway. The man whose face she'd spent 3 years trying to forget and couldn't. Her mop clattered to the floor. Water spilled across the tile, running downward like an accusation. She gripped the railing as the tremor spread from her hand to her entire arm, the patch inside her jacket suddenly too heavy to bear, pressing against her ribs like a hand trying to stop her heart. Downstairs, Caldwell was already taking command. His voice carried through the ER like a disease. Proper protocols, people. This is a military VIP. Make sure everyone knows I'm handling this personally. He was calling the hospital president. Calling board members. Ensuring every decision came through him, ensuring every credit belonged to him, ensuring that when this colonel survived, if he survived, Caldwell would be the doctor people thanked. Katie descended the stairs one at a time, her legs screaming, and watched through the trauma bay window as Caldwell examined Hale, his movements efficient and certain. The colonel's vitals were dropping. The monitors beginning to scream. The color draining from Hale's face. Cardiothoracic stuck in surgery, a nurse rushed past, her voice tight. 12-minute ETA. Patients decompensating. Katie saw what Caldwell wasn't seeing. The distended neck veins. The trachea shifting. The subtle signs of a tension pneumothorax, air leaking into the pleural space, collapsing the lung, crushing the heart with every breath Hale took. Minutes from complete cardiovascular collapse. Minutes from the monitors flattling for the 3rd and final time. Caldwell was ordering chest X-rays. Waiting for the surgeon. Following protocol while the patient died. Katie's hand went to her jacket lining, feeling the patch, feeling markers, feeling remedy, and something ancient and hardened inside her broke open like a grenade. She pushed through the trauma bay doors, and the room went completely silent. Every eye turned toward the woman in the custodial uniform, the woman who wasn't permitted to be there, the woman who looked at Colonel Hale like she was staring at a ghost. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she already knew exactly what needed to happen next. The trauma alert crackled across the overhead system at 1800 hours exactly. Katie was finishing the fourth-floor hallway when the voice cut through the fluorescent hum, incoming critical transfer, ETA 3 minutes, Special Forces Colonel, multiple GSW, flatline twice in transport, all hands to Trauma Bay 1. She knew that voice. She knew that rank. She knew, somehow, before anyone said the name. Colonel Richard Hale. The man who'd court-martialed her in Ramadi. The officer who'd signed the false charges that destroyed everything she'd spent 3 years rebuilding. The reason she wore scrubs instead of the uniform she'd bled for. The reason her husband Marcus was buried in Arlington with a folded flag instead of coming home. Katie's hands gripped the mop handle so tightly the wood began to splinter beneath her palms. Muscle memory didn't tremble. Muscle memory didn't blink. Muscle memory didn't do anything but calculate. Cardiac arrest twice in transport meant his lungs might be compromised, meant his heart had already failed twice and kept failing, meant the window was closing faster than a sniper scope. She set down the mop. The hallway was already chaos when she moved toward Trauma Bay 1, nurses sprinting past in pairs, the crash cart rolling with the sound of disaster wheels on tile, someone shouting for O negative, someone else calling for the cardiothoracic surgeon who wouldn't arrive for 12 minutes, maybe more if traffic on Military Highway was bad. Katie had learned to read rooms the way other people read books, and this room was screaming. The stretcher burst through the doors with Hale on it, conscious just long enough for his eyes to find hers. Recognition flashed across his face like a defibrillator charging. Then he flatlined again, and the monitor erupted into the thin line of asystole, no heartbeat, no rhythm, nothing but the slow electronic scream of a body shutting down. "Get that custodian out of my trauma bay," Caldwell's voice cut through the noise, sharp and vicious. He'd spun around at the sound of her footsteps, his face flushing the particular shade of red that meant he was already building his narrative, already spinning his story. Security! Now! But Katie was already at the crash cart. Her hands moved before her mind caught up. They belonged to someone else now, someone who'd held the line in Ramadi when the building was shaking apart and the screaming wouldn't stop. The scalpel came up from the tray with the weight of history in her grip. She could smell the antiseptic, sharp and metallic, could hear the ventilator preparing to breathe for a dead man, could feel the cold stainless steel of the surgical tray beneath her fingertips. He has a tension pneumothorax, bilateral shift visible on the mediastinum, trachea deviation at least 2 centimeters. Her voice dropped an octave, the tone of someone who'd commanded a field hospital under siege for 72 hours. 90 seconds before complete cardiovascular collapse. You can call security or you can assist. Choose now. She didn't wait for an answer. The scalpel found the 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line, the same location where she'd performed this exact procedure in a desert compound with incoming fire shaking the concrete walls. Her hands knew the geography of human anatomy the way a pilot knows the sky. Muscle, fascia, pleura, each layer separating beneath the blade with the precision of someone who'd done this 100 times, in conditions infinitely worse. The hiss of air escaping. That sound. The beautiful, terrible sound of pressure releasing, of a collapsed lung reinflating, of a dying man getting a second chance at consciousness. Hale's oxygen saturation was climbing, 34, 41, 52, 68, 78. The monitor picked up a rhythm, slow, chaotic, but there. A heartbeat. A actual beating heart inside a man who should have been dead, who would have been dead if Caldwell had managed to eject her from the room 30 seconds earlier. Her hands were shaking now, but not from fear. The trembling was restraint, muscle memory trying to hold together a woman who'd just saved the life of the man who'd destroyed hers. The trembling was the sound of her composure cracking at the edges like old paint. The trembling was the sound of Marcus's coffin closing all over again. The trembling was 19 years of controlled precision threatening to explode into something raw and terrible. She kept her hand steady inside Hale's chest. The cardiothoracic surgeon burst through the doors at minute 11, stopping short as he took in the scene, a woman in a hospital custodian's uniform with her hands inside a colonel's thoracic cavity, blood covering her wrists to the elbows, her eyes locked on the monitor with the concentration of someone reading scripture. Who the hell? The surgeon moved forward, took in her hands, her face, her unwavering focus on the surgical field. She saved his life. Another 60 seconds and he'd be in permanent asystole. Katie stepped back. She'd trained him. She'd trained dozens of surgeons, before Ramadi, before the explosion that shattered her femur and her career, before she'd become invisible. The muscle memory released her hands and she turned to find Caldwell staring at her with an expression she couldn't parse. Fear, maybe. Or something worse. His eyes traveled from her face to her blood-stained hands to the scalpel still in her grip. Then he reached for his phone, already dialing, his jaw set with the kind of focused hatred that only comes when a man realizes the hierarchy he's built is made of cardboard. "Yes, this is Dr. Caldwell," he said into the phone, his voice smooth as oil on water. "I need to file an official incident report. One of my staff members, a custodian named Katie Morrison, just interfered with a trauma resuscitation and committed an unauthorized surgical procedure. I want her credentials flagged, her hospital access revoked immediately, and yes, I'll hold." He was already building the case. Already reshaping the narrative. Already turning her salvation into her execution, turning her muscle memory into insubordination, turning 18 years of careful invisibility into a weapon he could use against her. The blood on her hands was already drying, turning brown at the edges. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, pressed against her ribs, felt like a brand. The scalpel was already in her hand. Not because someone gave it to her, because her body knew before her mind caught up, muscle memory from 15 years of field medicine pulling her toward the instrument tray like gravity. The tension pneumothorax was visual now, the colonel's chest wall collapsing inward with each breath he couldn't take, his oxygen saturation dropping like a stone through water. 68, 64. 61, the monitor beeped its desperate rhythm. "I need to decompress," Katie said. Not a request. Not a question. Dr. Caldwell stood frozen at the trauma bay entrance, his mouth opening and closing like a fish in a tank. Around her, the trauma team scattered, anesthesia backing away, the resident stepping sideways, everyone suddenly remembering they had somewhere else to be. They could feel it. The shift in air pressure when someone steps into their element. Katie's hands moved on their own. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the needle would go there first, but there wasn't time for a needle. Hale's oxygen was 59 now. His blood pressure was a whisper. The surgical airway was already placed, but air had nowhere to go. The pressure inside his chest cavity was crushing his heart, suffocating his lungs, killing him by inches. She made the incision. One clean line, for centimeters, right through the pectoralis. The scalpel was part of her hand. Her hand was part of the machine. Pain was information, and her body was reading every variable. Blood. Not the alarming kind, controlled seepage, the kind that told you the vessels were still intact. She widened the entry with a hemostat, her movements precise as a surgeon's despite the 40-year gap since her last operating room, despite everything that had happened, despite the fact that the man she was saving was the same officer who destroyed her career. The ribs spread under her fingers. She felt them, counted them, move between the fourth and fifth like she'd done this yesterday instead of a lifetime ago. Her fingertip found the entry point, a 1 centimeter laceration in the pleural membrane, traumatized from the stab wound that had started this cascade. "Chest tube, 36 French," she said. Someone, the trauma nurse, bless her, had it ready. Katie inserted it, felt the give as it entered the chest cavity, and then the hiss. Air escaping. Pressure releasing. The sound of a man getting a second chance. The monitor responded immediately. Oxygen climbing. 62, 68. 74, the heart rate steadied. Blood pressure began its slow resurrection, climbing back toward something a human body could survive on. The pale ashen color of his face stayed ashen, but it stopped getting worse. That was enough. Katie's hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. She worked like a woman who had done this 1,000 times, because she had, just not in a hospital. Not in 15 years. But muscle memory didn't care about time. It cared about survival. She secured the tube, checked the placement, verified the sinus rhythm on the monitor. Stable. His pupils were reactive. His oxygen sat was 91% and climbing. She looked at the anesthesiologist. Get him to the OR. I want a cardiothoracic team standing by. The anesthesiologist moved. Everyone moved. The trauma bay suddenly became a precision instrument again, coordinated and efficient. Katie stepped back, and that's when she felt it, the weight of the silence. Not the natural silence of focused medical professionals working. Something else. Something cold. Dr. Caldwell was still standing in the doorway. His face had gone a specific shade of red that looked like rage trying to wear the mask of shock. His eyes were locked on her hands, on the blood that had soaked through her gloves, on the absolute certainty that what he'd just witnessed was competence of a kind he'd never possessed and never would. Katie peeled off the gloves. She didn't meet his eyes. She simply walked to the sink, began washing the blood away, feeling it swirl down the drain in diluting pink spirals. Her heart rate was normal. Her hands were steady. The person she'd been for 3 years, the quiet nurse, the invisible woman, the one who accepted insults and demotion without resistance, had been an act. Caldwell's voice, when it came, sounded hollow. That was an unauthorized procedure. Katie didn't turn around. That was a life. She dried her hands on the paper towel dispenser, and the sound it made, the mechanical whir, the cardboard tearing, was the loudest thing in the room. The colonel was wheeled out. The trauma team dispersed. And Katie walked toward the break room, leaving Caldwell standing alone in a bay that suddenly felt much smaller than it had before. But that wasn't the worst part. Caldwell moved fast. Within 20 minutes, he'd paged security. Within 45 minutes, Katie was being escorted from the hospital by 2 uniformed guards while Caldwell watched from the nursing station, his phone already pressed to his ear, his voice cool and composed as he explained to someone on the other end, yes. Unauthorized surgery. Insubordination. Patient safety concerns. I'm requesting her credentials be reviewed immediately. Katie surrendered her badge without a word. She'd learned long ago that speech was a luxury you lost in interrogations. Silence was armor. Over the next 48 hours, Dr. Caldwell transformed from frustrated supervisor into a strategist of remarkable thoroughness. He reassigned every member of the trauma team to different shifts, different teams, actually, so that no one who'd witnessed the thoracotomy would be on duty together long enough to coordinate testimony. He altered the incident report with the precision of a man who'd learned documentation could be a weapon. The word unauthorized appeared 4 times. The word reckless appeared 6. The phrase apparent prior military training not disclosed appeared in a paragraph that connected her life-saving action to a potential pattern of hiding information. He scheduled board interviews with members he'd cultivated over years of consulting contracts and golf games. He made phone calls to colleagues at other hospitals, careful not to quite lie, just to ask questions. You wouldn't happen to know anything about her background, would you? Asking for institutional security purposes. And then he filed a request with the military's Personnel Records Division. Patient safety concerns, he'd written. If Nurse Katie Morrison has undisclosed military training, we need to understand how extensive it is. We need to review her background thoroughly. He didn't know what he'd find. He only knew he needed to bury her completely before anyone started asking why a night shift custodian was more medically competent than the emergency medicine physician running the trauma bay. In the ICU, Colonel Hale remained unconscious but stable. His chart had been flagged VIP by someone, probably administration, who'd gotten a call from someone higher up the chain. His son's name was listed as next of kin. Lieutenant James Hale. The name meant nothing to Caldwell. But Katie knew it. She'd heard that name screamed in a field hospital in Ramadi while insurgent mortars fell like rain on a crumbling roof. She'd heard that name in a dying man's final words as his blood had soaked through her combat bandage and into the ground beneath her feet. 2 days after the emergency thoracotomy, Katie drove to Arlington Memorial Cemetery in a storm. The rain hammered against her windshield, relentless, cold, the kind of rain that felt personal. She parked and walked uphill to the grave marked with white marble and a 7th Special Forces group patch engraved in bronze. Staff Sergeant Marcus Morrison. Her husband. KIA Ramadi, 2009. She knelt in the mud beside the headstone, and the faded unit patch, the same patch that was still sewn inside her jacket lining with stitches she'd done herself 14 years ago, fell from her shaking hands into the wet grass. It had come loose. The threads were finally giving up. The rain was so loud she could barely hear her own voice. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I failed again. Just like I failed you in Ramadi. I wasn't fast enough then, and I'm not strong enough now. They took everything from me twice, and I let them. I let them." The trembling started in her shoulders. Not the controlled, manageable kind. The kind that came from grief so old and so heavy that even composure couldn't hold it anymore. She knelt in the mud with her hands pressed against the marble, feeling the rain on her back, feeling the weight of every year she'd spent invisible, every day she'd swallowed down rage and humiliation to stay safe, to stay hidden. The wind gusted. A siren wailed in the distance somewhere across the city. And Katie Morrison, Major Katie Morrison, 7th Special Forces Group, the woman who'd held a field hospital together with will and medical training and sheer refusal to let her soldiers die, finally let herself break. The phone call to the Pentagon Records Office came at 11:41 p.m. on a Tuesday. Dr. Caldwell sat in his office with the door locked, the fluorescent light casting his face in shadows like a skull. He'd rehearsed the lie so many times it came out smooth as silk. Patient safety concerns. Credential verification. Nothing unusual. Just routine due diligence on a nurse whose judgment he was beginning to question in his official capacity as Chief of Emergency Medicine. The records officer on the other end didn't ask questions, they never did when the request came from hospital administration. Caldwell wrote down the case file number, hung up, and smiled. 48 hours. That's what he figured he needed. Katie Morrison's service record would arrive, some disciplinary action or dishonorable discharge would be buried in there, and he'd have the ammunition to finish what he'd started. She'd made a fool of him in front of the entire ER. Nobody did that to Dr. Marcus Caldwell. Nobody ever did. What he didn't know was that the moment his name appeared on the Pentagon database, 3 separate alerts triggered in 3 different offices in Arlington. What he didn't know was that Katie Morrison's service record was classified at levels that made most doctors' security clearances look like library cards. What he didn't know was that he'd just set off an automated flag in a JSOC task force office that had been monitoring her case file for 3 years, waiting for exactly this kind of inquiry. But Caldwell wasn't thinking about any of that. He was already moving to Phase 2. He called in favors at administration, people he'd helped with grants, people who owed him for writing their tenure recommendations, people who understood the delicate art of eliminating problems before they became headlines. He drafted his incident reports, his version of events on the night of the emergency thoracotomy, carefully worded to emphasize Katie's recklessness, her violation of protocol, her unauthorized intervention in a procedure that should have been handled by the surgical team. He included specific times, specific witnesses, specific details that made it all sound so reasonable when you didn't know the truth. By midnight, he'd scheduled 3 separate witness interviews for the next morning. 3 nurses who'd been in the trauma bay. 3 nurses who'd watched Katie save a man's life. He knew at least one of them would go along with his version of events. People usually did when their jobs were on the line, when their performance reviews suddenly depended on their memory of events. Colonel Richard Hale remained unconscious in the recovery suite on the 4th floor, machines breathing for him, monitoring his heartbeat, dripping antibiotics and pain management directly into his veins. The thoracotomy had saved his life. Every doctor on the surgical team knew it. Every cardiologist who'd examined him knew it. But Caldwell had already begun rewriting the narrative. She'd operated without authorization. She'd compromised sterile protocol. She'd been working night shift on an assignment designed for routine patient care, not emergency intervention. The more he wrote, the more the lie began to feel like truth, even to him. He was a master at this, the careful construction of plausible deniability, the weaponization of bureaucracy, the slow strangulation of a career through administrative procedure instead of honest confrontation. Meanwhile, Katie Morrison stood in the rain at Riverside Cemetery in Norfolk, her shoes sinking into the soft earth, the November cold biting through the thin fabric of her jacket. The headstone read Marcus James Morrison, 1978 to 2015, beloved husband and soldier. 7 years. It had been 7 years since the IED in Ramadi took him, since she'd gotten the call at 0300 hours and collapsed in the barracks, since she'd had to identify his remains because nobody else knew him well enough to do it right. She'd been standing at this grave for 40 minutes, letting the rain soak through her clothes, letting it mix with the tears she'd promised herself she wouldn't cry anymore. The faded unit patch was in her hand, 7th Special Forces Group, sewn into the jacket lining so carefully that nobody would ever see it unless they were looking. Marcus had done that. He'd stitched it in the night before deploying, told her it would keep her safe if anything happened to him. Superstition disguised as devotion. She pressed it against her ribs now, feeling the rough fabric through her wet shirt, and whispered to the stone, to the ground, to the version of her husband who existed only in memory. "I'm sorry, Marcus." Her voice was barely audible above the rain. "I failed again. Just like I failed you in Ramadi." She'd kept him alive for 72 hours. 72 hours of holding his artery closed with her hands while the field hospital crumbled around them, while insurgents fired mortars into the compound, while she made impossible choices about who got the last 4 bag, the last unit of blood, the last chance at living. And in the end, the infection had won anyway. Septic shock. She'd seen it coming 2 days before it took him, and she couldn't stop it. She'd held his hand while he died, told him the helicopter was 20 minutes out, knew it was a lie but told it anyway because some mercies are measured in false hope. Now she was watching history repeat itself. She'd saved Colonel Hale, the man who'd destroyed her career, who'd court-martialed her on falsified charges, who'd invalidated everything she'd done in Ramadi. And her reward was about to be termination. Administrative leave pending review. Career destruction carefully masked as bureaucratic procedure. She'd become what she'd always feared, invisible and helpless, watching the machinery of institutional cruelty grind forward, unable to stop it. The rain hammered harder, and Katie Morrison knelt there in the mud, clutching a patch that was all she had left of a man who'd believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. She had no idea that at that exact moment, across 3 states and through classified networks that existed in spaces she didn't know about, a message was being sent. A message that had her name in it. A message that would arrive at Sacred Heart Hospital before the sun came up. Dawn broke grey and cold over Norfolk on a Thursday morning. The first sign something was wrong came when the normal hospital quiet was shattered by a sound most people in the building had never heard in person, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of helicopter rotors descending toward the helipad on the hospital roof. Nobody called ahead for med flights at that hour. The landing was violent and precise, the kind of approach that spoke of military discipline and absolute confidence in the aircraft. Wind from the rotors shook the upper floors. Equipment rattled on shelves. Monitors flickered. 2 men in Navy dress uniforms deplaned before the rotors even spooled down. They moved with the fluid precision of people who'd trained their bodies to operate in environments where hesitation meant death. Their uniforms bore the distinctive trident insignia. SEALs. They carried no weapons visible, no need for weapons in a hospital, but their bearing suggested they wouldn't need them anyway. They walked directly into the building without stopping at security, without asking for directions. Someone had given them a map, probably coordinates from somewhere very official. They went straight to the administration wing on the 3rd floor, where the hospital president's office was located, and the lead SEAL, call sign Breaker, according to the insignia on his chest, spoke into his radio in a voice that carried like he was used to being heard over helicopter noise. Angel 6 is in the building. Requesting Major Morrison, call sign Reaper 6. Repeat, requesting Major Morrison by call sign. She's a patient contact we need to debrief immediately. The hospital president's secretary nearly fell out of her chair. The name Major Morrison meant nothing to her. There was no Major in her employee database. The president was in meetings. Nobody knew what was happening. By the time anyone could ask questions, the second SEAL was already asking for personnel records, for shift schedules, for any information that would help them locate her. Caldwell appeared in the hallway, still in his pressed white coat, still moving with the arrogance of a man who assumed he was the highest authority in any room. He saw the uniforms and moved toward them with his hand extended, his opening words already forming some version of authority establishing its dominance. The lead SEAL didn't look at his hand. He looked at Caldwell the way someone might look at an interesting stain on the floor. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and level and utterly devoid of emotion. Dr. Caldwell, we're going to need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and I want you to understand that everything I'm about to say has been declassified specifically for this moment. He pulled a file from his uniform jacket. It was marked with a red stripe across the top, declassified. He opened it and began to speak, and his words fell into the hallway like stones into still water, each one creating ripples that would spread outward in ways Caldwell couldn't yet comprehend. Distinguished Service Cross. A pause. Caldwell's face went still. Awarded for extraordinary heroism under fire in Ramadi. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. Awarded for sustained meritorious conduct in combat operations. Purple Heart. Awarded for wounds received in action. Another medal. Then another. The SEAL's voice remained completely level, completely professional, like he was reading a grocery list instead of reading the combat history of a woman Caldwell had been systematically destroying. The only Special Forces combat medic to command a field hospital under active siege for 72 consecutive hours while carrying a level 3 femur fracture and operating on 4 hours of sleep across 3 days. Promoted to major in the field because the next senior officer was killed in an incoming mortar round and the position transferred to her by battlefield succession. Command ratings, 91 souls under fire. Casualty survival rate, 88%. The SEAL closed the file. Behind him, the second SEAL was already moving down the corridor toward the ER, already asking whether night shift nurses would be, already looking for a woman who walked through these halls like she was nobody. But that wasn't the worst part for Caldwell. That wasn't the moment his career truly ended. The moment came when the elevator doors opened and Colonel Richard Hale wheeled himself out, still pale, still recovering, but conscious and alive and carrying a second file in his lap. His eyes found Caldwell's and held them with the weight of absolute authority. The colonel's voice was rough from the ventilator tube, but it carried the authority of a man who'd commanded men in combat. I court-martialed her on false charges in Ramadi, Dr. Caldwell. I did my job poorly, and I've spent 3 years finding her to tell her the truth. The contractor who filed those charges was selling intelligence to the insurgency. Major Morrison saved my son's life in that field hospital. She held his hand when he died because I was out of communication. She wrote letters to his mother that we didn't know about until she tried to mail them and discovered we were already home. Hale's hand shook slightly as he held up the file. His voice cracked when he spoke next. She saved me. Again. On the night she did that procedure, I was the patient. She performed an emergency thoracotomy because her training took over and a man was dying and she couldn't let that happen. Her exoneration was approved 3 days ago at the Pentagon. Her rank has been restored. And there's someone from the White House waiting on a secure line to offer her a presidential citation and her back pay. The FBI agent stepped forward, and that's when Caldwell understood that this wasn't about vindication anymore. It was about consequences. The agent was holding files, his files, the ones he'd so carefully constructed, the incident reports he'd falsified, the witness statements he'd doctored. The agent's voice was the voice of institutional authority finally speaking. Dr. Caldwell, we need to talk about why your personnel records contain fabricated documentation designed to support a false termination case against a decorated military officer. We also need to discuss your unauthorized access attempt on classified military files, which triggered a Pentagon security alert that brought us here. You're under arrest for falsification of government documents, obstruction of justice, and whatever else we find in that stack of paperwork you've been building over the past 48 hours. The handcuffs were already in the agent's hand. The lead SEAL was already radioing that they needed to locate Major Morrison at her secondary location. They'd checked her assigned quarters. They needed the cemetery address. The hospital president was already on the phone with legal counsel, already preparing the damage control statement, already writing the narrative that would separate the institution from the man being led away in handcuffs. Caldwell's carefully constructed world collapsed in the time it took for one sentence to be spoken. At Riverside Cemetery, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy and gray, the color of concrete, the color of institutions that ground people down into dust. Katie Morrison was still kneeling at Marcus's grave when the Black Hawk approached from the north, not landing, just hovering long enough for a single rope to drop. The lead SEAL descended on a fast rope, his boots touching the wet grass like he'd done this 1,000 times, probably had. He knelt beside her, and his voice, when he spoke, was gentle in a way that suggested he'd delivered news like this before, in cemeteries and living rooms and hospital waiting rooms. Major Morrison. Colonel Hale is awake. He's been searching for you for 3 years. Your court-martial has been overturned at the Pentagon. Your rank is restored. And there's someone from the White House who needs to speak with you. Katie looked up, rain and tears on her face, unable to speak. The SEAL extended his hand, and she took it, and let him pull her up, and let him guide her toward the helicopter that was already spinning up its rotors for departure. As they lifted off, she looked down at the grave, at Marcus's headstone disappearing beneath the rotor's wind, and whispered something no one could hear over the noise. Back at Sacred Heart, federal agents were walking Caldwell out through the corridors where he'd humiliated her. They moved him through the ER where she'd saved a man's life. They passed the nursing station where he'd made that overhead page, where staff had laughed at her, where his authority had felt absolute just 48 hours ago. His hands were cuffed behind his back. His white coat hung off his shoulders like skin he'd already shed. The perp walk went past every location where he'd established his power, and staff watched in silence, the understanding spreading through the building like blood through water. Someone whispered, he tried to destroy a war hero. The words carried. The phrase repeated. By the time the FBI loaded him into their vehicle outside the loading dock, every person in Sacred Heart Hospital knew that the woman they'd mocked had been Major Katie Morrison the entire time. The woman who'd cleaned floors while carrying 2 Bronze Stars. The woman who'd pushed a mop while holding a combat record that would never be public, not fully, not in their civilian world. The woman who'd let herself be invisible so thoroughly that even her humiliation hadn't been real, because you can't humiliate someone who exists on a plane higher than you can perceive. The news crews arrived before his vehicle left the parking lot. Thank you for being here. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. And we always love hearing from you. Drop a comment and tell us what state or country you're in.